Is Donald Trump destined to be the Republican Jimmy Carter? I know this might sound crazy, but hear me out. There has been a presidential cyclical theory that has been floating around the internet for more than a decade. I believe that it originated from political scientist Stephen Skowronek's book Presidential Leadership in Political Time. Take a look at this chart. As you can see, the presidential terms follow a pattern. The Democrats controlled the presidency for 3 terms, then the Republicans controlled the presidency for 2 terms, then the Democrats controlled the presidency for 2 terms, then the Republicans controlled the presidency for 2 terms, and then the Democrats controlled the presidency for 1 term. This was followed by the Republicans controlling the presidency for 3 terms, then the Democrats controlling the presidency for 2 terms, then the Republicans controlling the presidency for 2 terms, then the Democrats controlling the presidency for 2 terms, and then, if this cycle continues, the Republicans controlling the presidency for 1 term. The period between 1941 to 1981 exactly mirrors the period between 1981 to maybe 2021. According to the theory, the period between 1929 to 1977 was the era of liberal dominance, since the Democrats held the presidency for 28 years during this 48-year time period, and even the Republicans who were elected during this time period were pretty liberal. The period between 1977 to 2021 is the era of conservative dominance, since the Republicans will have held the presidency for 24 years during this 44-year time period, and even the Democrats who were elected during this time period were pretty conservative. The cycle goes like this: Herbert Hoover equals Jimmy Carter, Franklin D. Roosevelt equals Ronald Reagan, Harry Truman equals George H.W. Bush, Dwight Eisenhower equals Bill Clinton, John F. Kennedy / Lyndon B. Johnson equal George W. Bush, Richard Nixon / Gerald Ford equal Barack Obama, and Herbert Hoover and Jimmy Carter equal Donald Trump. Going by this theory, Trump should lose to a far-left Democrat in 2020 who ushers an era of liberal dominance. Wait, how does Obama parallel Nixon? How does Donald Trump parallel Hoover and Carter? How does any of this make sense? Let's dive into the details, shall we? First up, Hoover and Carter. Both Hoover and Carter were one-term, outsider presidents who were considered to be failures. Hoover shifted the GOP to the left, while Carter shifted the Democrats to the right. They both were defeated in a landslide in their re-election bids, and because of them the opposite party became dominant for a long period of time. Next up, FDR and Reagan. Both of these presidents are considered to be the heroes of their respective parties. FDR shifted the Democratic Party to the left and enacted a plethora of groundbreaking liberal policies, while Reagan shifted the Republican Party to the right and enacted a plethora of groundbreaking conservative policies. FDR became a liberal icon, while Reagan became a conservative icon. FDR began the New Deal coalition, which led to a Democratic Party dominance in elections, while Reagan began a conservative coalition, which has led to a Republican Party dominance in elections. They are both considered the godfathers of their respective ideologies. After that, we have Truman and Bush Sr. Both Truman and Bush Sr. were one-term presidents. Truman presided over the fall of Nazi Germany and the beginning of tensions with Soviet Russia with the Cold War. Bush Sr. presided over the fall of the Soviet Union and the beginning of tensions in the Middle East with the Gulf War. However, they both failed to live up to their predecessors, had low approval ratings at the end of their first terms, and were eventually replaced by political moderates from the opposite party. Next up, we have Eisenhower and Clinton. Both Eisenhower and Clinton were politically moderate presidents who presided over a decade of peace and prosperity. Eisenhower broke a streak of Democratic victories and became the first 2-term Republican president in a long time, while Clinton broke a streak of Republican victories and became the first 2-term Democratic president in a long time. Since liberal policies were popular during Eisenhower's era and the Democrats controlled Congress for most of his presidency, he had to govern from the political center and enact several liberal policies such as the expansion of Social Security, the interstate highway system, and desegregation. Likewise, since conservative policies were popular during Clinton's era and the Republicans controlled Congress for most of his presidency, he had to govern from the political center and enact several conservative policies such as welfare reform, deregulation, and NAFTA. They both governed during a decade characterized by world peace, with the exception of Korea and Kosovo, and economic growth, and enjoyed widespread, bipartisan popularity during their presidencies. The 1950s and 1990s were very similar decades. After that, we have JFK/LBJ and GWB. Both Kennedy and Bush barely won their respective elections against the vice president of the current administration at the time. Despite Eisenhower's popularity and a booming economy, Nixon was unable to win in a landslide due to his lack of charisma. Despite Clinton's popularity and a booming economy, Gore was unable to win in a landslide due to his lack of charisma. Both Kennedy and Bush were members of prominent political dynasties, charismatic, and defeated their opponents by very narrow margins to the point where many accused both of them of rigging their elections. Kennedy and Johnson's presidencies were plagued by war, chaos, and Red Scare, and thus the expansion of domestic surveillance and security. Bush's presidency was plagued by war, chaos, and a fear of terrorism, and thus the expansion of domestic surveillance and security. Johnson parallels Cheney since they were both old, experienced men who pulled the strings during the presidencies of the young, inexperienced Kennedy and the young, inexperienced Bush. The Vietnam War was a failure, a blunder, and deeply unpopular with the American people, while the Iraq War was a failure, a blunder, and deeply unpopular with the American people. The next president in both cases are of the opposite party largely because of the unpopularity of these wars. I know that Bush wasn't assassinated in 2003 and replaced by Cheney like how Kennedy was assassinated in 1963 and replaced by Johnson, but think of Bush's presidency as Kennedy's presidency if he weren't assassinated. If Kennedy wasn't assassinated, it is very likely that his presidency would have turned out to be very similar to Bush's presidency. Think of Bush as Kennedy if he weren't assassinated. Finally, we have Nixon/Ford and Obama. In my opinion, this is the most far-fetched of all of these comparisons, but it still works very well. The Republican Party really began moving to the right during Nixon's presidency, and the conservative faction of the party began to gain traction. Nixon assembled a winning political coalition based on the fastest-growing voting bloc of middle-class suburban whites and made inroads with groups that were once solidly Democratic such as Southerners and blue-collar whites. Nixon won in 1968 largely due to the unpopularity of the Vietnam War, a war which ended during his presidency. Nixon began what became known as the Southern Strategy and FDR's New Deal coalition began to dismantle. Although Nixon wanted to govern as a conservative, he was unable to do so due to the fact that the Democrats controlled Congress for most of his presidency and refused to compromise with him. Nixon's presidency was characterized by an antagonistic relationship with a radicalized opposition party who absolutely refused to work with him. Because of the hostile opposition he faced from the Democrats, he had to govern as a moderate, enacted many liberal policies such as the establishment of EPA, integration, and the Endangered Species Act, and failed to become the conservative hero he wanted to be. Ultimately, his presidency was plagued by the Watergate scandal, which led to the defeat of his former Secretary of State Gerald Ford against anti-establishment, political outsider Jimmy Carter in 1976. It is likely that the Republicans would have won the 1976 election without Watergate. Ultimately, Nixon failed to crystallize his coalition, which Reagan would do years later. Likewise, the Democratic Party began moving to the left during Obama's presidency. Obama assembled a winning political coalition based on the fastest-growing voter bloc of Hispanics and immigrants and made inroads with groups that were once solidly Republican such as Northern whites and voters in the Rocky Mountain states. Obama's victory is when Reagan's conservative coalition began to dismantle. Obama won in 2008 largely due to the unpopularity of the Iraq War, which ended during his presidency. Although Obama wanted to govern as a liberal, he was unable to do so due to the fact that the Republicans controlled Congress for most of his presidency and refused to compromise with him. Obama's presidency was characterized by an antagonistic relationship with a radicalized opposition party who absolutely refused to work with him. Because of the hostile opposition he faced from the Republicans, he had to govern as a moderate, enacted many conservative policies such as Obamacare, which resembled many plans from Republican politicians in the 90s that were meant to be conservative, free market alternatives to universal health care such as Romneycare, the expansion of NSA surveillance programs, and the expansion of the use of drones, and failed to become the liberal hero he wanted to be. Ultimately, his presidency was plagued by the Benghazi and email scandals, which led to the defeat of his former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton against anti-establishment, political outsider Donald Trump in 2016. It is likely that the Democrats would have won the 2016 election without the Benghazi and email scandals. Ultimately, Obama failed to crystallize his coalition, which if this theory is correct, Trump's predecessor will do years later. I know that Obama didn't resign due to a scandal, but think of Obama's presidency as Nixon's presidency without the Watergate scandal. It is very likely that Nixon's presidency would have turned out very similar to Obama's presidency without Watergate. Now back to the topic of this video, how does Jimmy Carter parallel Donald Trump? Believe it or not, there are many similarities. Jimmy Carter started out as an anti-establishment, political outsider who was thought of in the beginning as having no chance of winning the Democratic primary. Jimmy Carter was hated by the Democratic Party establishment. The Democratic Party establishment did everything they could to stop him from winning. A movement known as Anybody But Carter, or ABC, arose within the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party even established a superdelegate system after Carter won the nomination just to make sure that a candidate like him would never win the Democratic nomination ever again. Many prominent Democratic Party politicians like Ted Kennedy refused to endorse Carter after he won the nomination. However, at a time of rampant corruption and increasing distrust in the Washington establishment, Carter's status as a Washington outsider is why he gained so much popularity with voters. At first, people thought that Carter had absolutely no chance of winning the Democratic primary, but he stood out in a very crowded field and shocked the world by winning the primary and then the general election. He made big inroads with working-class whites that had voted for Nixon by posing as an anti-establishment, populist, Washington outsider, which was the main factor behind his victory. Carter also won despite a leaked interview with Playboy where he bragged about sexually inappropriate behavior. On the Republican side, Ford was originally considered to be the likely nominee, but he received a primary challenge from Ronald Reagan. Reagan ran as a staunch conservative against the moderate Gerald Ford. Reagan's campaign shifted the Republican Party and Gerald Ford to the right and made conservative ideas more mainstream. Reagan exceeded expectations and only narrowly lost the primary to Ford. Once Ford lost the general election, Reagan became the central figure of the Republican Party and other GOP politicians shifted to the right and tried to emulate Reagan as much as possible. Carter's presidency was characterized by extreme incompetence. Despite the fact that the Democrats controlled both chambers of Congress for the first half of his presidency, Carter was unable to get much done due to the hostile relationship between him and members of his own party. His only major accomplishment was the establishment of the Departments of Education and Energy. He got almost nothing done due to his incompetence. Additionally, he often departed from the objectives of the American left, especially on economic issues, which angered the Democratic Party establishment. He wanted to increase the defense budget, supported the deregulation of the airline industry, and rejected the idea of a national health insurance program. Carter's presidency began shifting the Democratic Party to the right on economic issues, which was intensified during the presidency of Bill Clinton. However, the Democratic Party base became more dogmatic and partisan than ever before during Carter's presidency. In addition, Carter's presidency was also plagued by stagflation, the Iran hostage crisis, and a recession. His 1976 victory marked the last victory of FDR's New Deal coalition, before it collapsed with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Carter's failure as president scars the Democratic Party's image for a generation. Generation X, aka the generation that grew up under Carter, is overwhelmingly Republican and conservative largely because they grew up under Carter's failed presidency. Carter's failure ultimately led to Republican Party and conservative dominance in American politics. Due to growing up under the Vietnam War and the presidency of Jimmy Carter, this generation became largely Republican and politically conservative. Carter's presidency destroyed liberalism and the Democratic Party for a generation. Does this sound familiar at all? Likewise, Donald Trump started out as an anti-establishment, Washington outsider who was thought of as having no chance of winning the Republican primary. Donald Trump was hated by the Republican Party establishment. The Republican Party establishment did everything they could to stop him from winning. A movement known as #NeverTrump arose within the Republican Party, and the GOP tried to prop up many alternatives to Trump such as Jeb, Rubio, and Kasich who failed to appeal to the GOP base like Trump could. Many prominent Republican Party politicians such as Kasich refused to endorse Trump after he won the nomination. However, at a time when Hillary was plagued with an email scandal and voter distrust in the establishment, Trump's status as a populist, anti-establishment, political outsider appealed to many voters. Although people thought that Donald Trump had no chance of winning at first, he shocked the world by winning the primaries and then the general election. Donald Trump won largely due to making big inroads with working-class whites who voted for Obama in 2008 and / 2012 with his anti-establishment, populist, anti-globalization message. Trump also won despite a leaked recording where he bragged about sexually inappropriate behavior. On the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton was originally thought of as the inevitable nominee, but she received a primary challenge from Bernie Sanders. Sanders ran as a staunch progressive against the moderate Hillary Clinton. Bernie's campaign shifted the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton to the left and made left-wing ideas more mainstream. Sanders exceeded expectations and only narrowly lost the primary to Hillary Clinton. Once Clinton lost the general election, Bernie became the central figure of the Democratic Party, and other Democratic politicians have shifted to the left and have tried to emulate him as much as possible. Trump's presidency has been characterized by extreme incompetence. Despite the fact that the Republicans control both chambers of Congress, Trump has been unable to get much done due to the hostile relationship between him and members of his own party. He failed to get much legislation through Congress such as Trump Care. His only major accomplishment so far has been the Trump tax cuts. He has gotten almost nothing done due to his extreme incompetence. Additionally, he has often departed from the objectives of the American right, especially on economic issues, which has angered the Republican Party establishment. Unlike most GOP politicians, he is staunchly against free trade and vetoed the TPP. He has implemented tariffs and has angered conservatives by expressing support for things like gun control. Trump's presidency has begun shifting the Republican Party base to the left on economic issues, which is why polls have shown that a majority of Republican voters support Medicare for all, free college, and an increase in the minimum wage. However, the Republican Party base has also become more partisan and dogmatic than ever before. Much like Carter, Trump's image as an inexperienced buffoon has tarnished the Republican Party's image, especially amongst younger voters. Much like how Carter's presidency made liberal ideas very unpopular, Trump's presidency has made conservative ideas very unpopular. This, along with the rampant corruption, dysfunction, and gaffes, has made Donald Trump one of the least popular presidents in modern American history. His presidency has destroyed the Republican Party's image amongst millennials. After Trump took office, the percentage of millennials who are registered with the Republican Party has dropped to an all-time low, and conservative ideas have become much less popular with this generation, and thus liberal and even socialist ideas have become much more popular with this generation. Carter tarnished the Democratic Party's image for a generation, and Donald Trump will most likely tarnish the Republican Party's image for a generation. His 2016 victory will probably mark the last victory of Reagan's conservative coalition, before it collapses with the election of a Democrat in 2020 or 2024. Due to growing up under the Iraq War and the presidency of Donald Trump, millennials and Generation Z will likely be overwhelmingly Democratic and politically liberal. Additionally, the Democrats will most likely take over the House and / or the Senate this November, further decreasing the chance that Trump's presidency ends up successful. If this cycle continues, Trump should lose to a far-left Democrat in 2020 who ushers an era of Democratic Party dominance and crystallizes Obama's coalition, most likely Sanders, but it could also be someone else like Warren or Harris. In addition, Carter faced a serious primary challenge from Ted Kennedy in 1980, so Trump could face a serious primary challenge from someone like Kasich in 2020. I am not the first one to make this comparison. There have been several people who have compared Carter and Donald Trump. Do you think that Donald Trump will lose in 2020? What do you think of this presidential cyclical theory? I can't believe that this theory hasn't been discussed by the media more often. The parallels are very eerie. So far, the cycle has continued almost perfectly. Please like and share this video so that more people are aware of this theory. Remember that cyclical theories are a pseudoscience. They are fun to discuss, but should not be taken seriously. Time isn't cyclical, and thus this cycle could break in the future. Nevertheless, it is very interesting how the presidential terms have been following a pattern for nearly a century. Will this pattern continue in 2020? I guess we will have to wait to find out. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, share, and check out my other videos.